Hey, this is Keith again. This is part B of today's video. I'm not necessarily thinking this is for state of the snowpack. It kind of gets more into the kind of stuff that I teach to my AST2 students. So I love you guys. This is for you. We've had some really great courses this year. We had the lodge-based one at Hilda. We had one based out of Roslyn. So much good learning. And ooh, I might get a little emotional. The problems that we were dealing with during those courses compared to the problem now is so dramatic. And so it's such a great opportunity just to have a quick review of, what are we trying to teach in the AST2? And there's a lot of things, obviously, we're teaching. But I think one of the main things is when we get to trip planning and we look at that trip planner and we see the green and the yellow and the red, the green is pretty obvious, like go, like it's probably pretty good, use normal caution. The red is like, wow, that's a lot of risk. And then there's the yellow, it's that in between, and it's not clear cut, go or no go. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the yellow? We talked about last year how a lot of avalanche accidents happened in the yellow. So it's definitely not this like, oh, just probably go, it's fine. It's much more nuanced. So we've been talking about, well, what makes a difference? And avalanche problem is like front and center. What's the avalanche problem? Because ultimately, what the avalanche problem influences the consequence, right? And I love where I'm standing because behind me we have this same slope that I was talking about in the first part of this video. And it went big. It's filled in now, so you may not be able to really appreciate the depth of the layer, but it was over 1 meter. And that's a lot of avalanche debris, and dense too, like just big blocks. And again, this would have been more dramatic 2 mornings ago because it was fresh, and now it keeps snowing, and so it's covered and blown in. But I mean, let's go back to evaluating slopes, right? We talk about consequence, and we talk about what kind of terrain is this? I'm pausing, so you're thinking, what kind of terrain? Is this simple terrain? Is this challenging terrain? Is this complex terrain? Behind me, this slope. Obviously, it's steep enough. It's avalanche terrain. It's not a size 1 slope, so it's not simple. So is it challenging or is it complex? Now, sure, after an avalanche in here, it's easy to say, oh my God, it's complex terrain. But I mean, look at it. It's not a huge slope. And even despite the fact that, the avalanche was deep, again, the debris is covered, but I think you'd call it maybe a size 2 avalanche, maybe a 2.5 at the most. So I could argue that this is challenging terrain. Okay, so challenging terrain, it's considerable danger. 2 weeks ago, if we had an avalanche problem where the danger is only this deep, this is probably a modest consequence slope. Again, some of the things we've been talking about in AST2, we're trying to describe consequence. This is sort of a new thing, coming up with terminology. Right now, in the literature, we've got terrain trap or not a terrain trap. And there's not a whole lot of, room for the spectrum of terrain trap. So we've been talking about minimal consequence, modest consequence, severe consequence, and catastrophic. They're just terms, but they give us a spectrum of this idea of terrain trap. And terrain trap meaning like not just, how deep you're going to get buried, what are you going to hit, all the aspects of consequence that's included with that. And the one thing that we also need to think about when it comes to this idea of consequences, Are you ready? What's the difference between 2 weeks ago and now? How big was the avalanche problem 2 weeks ago? It was this big. How big is the avalanche problem now? It's this big. And that's a big difference in terms of consequence. And so I would say that this slope, like if you were here when this slid 2 days ago and got in this, I would say that's a pretty severe consequence. You got like so much debris, so thick, it's gonna bury you very easily. It's gonna make you hit the trees with a lot more force. When the problem was this thick, could we potentially think of this slope as modest consequence? That's maybe what I'm trying to argue, is that the depth of the layer plays a big role in the consequence and in our decision making. So when it comes back to, where am I going with all this, right? When it comes back to managing the yellow, that in between, is it not necessarily go, is it not necessarily no go, it's in between. We have to make decisions about where we're gonna ride. It depends on the avalanche problem. It comes down to consequence. And when a slope like this is a consequence of modest, maybe we'd ski it. But when it gets to a serious consequence, maybe we're going to avoid it. Anyway, just some thoughts. We'll talk more. With AST2 groups, we're still meeting monthly via Zoom. I love that it's not just about the limit to the days we spend together in the field. We continue over the whole season. And yeah, look forward to seeing you again on Zoom.